Wow, this is going really well. All right. Welcome everybody. Digital Dragons 2016, 5 years running. Fantastic. Everyone in Poland should be congratulated for coming to this fantastic event. I am Chris Avellone. If you don't know me, that is a good sign because I usually don't know who I am myself. I am a computer game designer. I love my profession very much. I used to live in Southern California, which is a beautiful place to visit, but don't stay there. And I now take my ugly American manners all over the world and live a very nomadic existence. And I live a very classy life, as you can tell from this cartoon. But most of the time, I do what I love, which is game design. And my current project is I'm currently freelancing on Divinity Original Sin 2, which has more original sins than the first original sin. So buckle up, be prepared. And I'm working on a variety of mystery projects as well, which hopefully should be announced sometime this year, and look forward to it because I'm certainly looking forward to it because I don't know when they're going to be announced. So that's part of the mystery. So usually I talk about writing because I am a game writer, which I had no idea was a profession, and neither did my mother, which caused her many tears when I kept trying to pursue that game career. And I usually talk about how beautiful writing is and how shitty game writing is. But today I want to talk about something a little bit different. I want to talk about the support structure that allows writing and good game design to be done, so that all the game writers out there can make sure their words count and that every single moment is devoted to the craft and not worrying about the craft, and hopefully makes their writing a little less shitty. So as is typical with many of my talks, I like to introduce a subject and then immediately go on a tangent about something else because I like being very, very random. And I'm going to talk about a phrase called produced. It's where you take the word producer and you actually turn it into a verb. And me and my friends use this word all the time, produced. We use it when someone decides where all 11 of us should go to lunch. We also use it when we decide how we're going to get there. And generally we use it every time someone introduces a problem and then gives a solution to that problem. We say, hell yes, that's been produced. And we're very, very excited about it, and that's why I add an exclamation mark at the end of this. Produced is sort of the ability to take a series of simple conditionals, and often they are very, very simple, like time, or I'm hungry, or oh my God, we have 15 minutes to make the deadline. And then we establish an action based on that. It's pretty simple. And ideally, these conditionals that we set up are not reactionary at all because there's nothing worse than a solely reactionary producer. Because producers like that, I treat like vampires. I find them very, very scary. The important thing, though, is that there are certain qualities about being a producer that applies to the design hierarchies I'm about to discuss in this presentation. Sometimes these producers can be very, very scary. Sometimes there's a bright point of light when it comes to the scary aspects. But the important thing is when you start to act like a member of production, whether you're in design or animation or art, either whether you're at the top level or whether you're at the bottom of the level, it makes everyone's life easier by acting more like a producer. And even better, some of the aspects I'm going to discuss today, there are ways to automate this process so you actually don't have to give it a lot of thought. The process takes care of itself. And that's part of the attitude to take into this panel and presentation as I go ahead. All right, so one other difference is I'd like this talk to be very communal. I'm going to leave time for questions at the end, so you can take all the wonderful assumptions that I have in this presentation and challenge them and say why I am full of shit, which I would love to hear from you guys because I deserve to be challenged, even though I'm rarely wrong. Almost never wrong. I would actually still drop the almost off that and just go never. But I really want you to challenge these assumptions. If you have been involved with a team or a process and you have found this particular procedure does not work for you, or you've had a positive experience where I had a very, 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 very negative one, I would love to hear about it. Also, while building this presentation, I discovered that on my third bottle of Jack Daniel's whiskey, that I started having arguments with myself. So I put all of these arguments into the presentation as well, and I want you to challenge them as well, because there is nothing sadder than an argument you only have with yourself. So I encourage you to challenge these things, because self-arguments are dumb, and we'll be able to do that later on, because I'm going to leave plenty of time for questions. So a few things before I begin this talk. This is assumption number one about how your design team is structured. And the first assumption is you already know what kind of game you're trying to make. It could be something as simple as, we want to make BioShock, but we want to make BioShock with dinosaurs. Great. I don't really care what kind of game you want to do, as long as everybody knows what that one sentence is. Next up, it also assumes that you know what the pillars of the game are. Like you're doing a survival horror game, you're doing a puzzle combat game. Again, I don't care about that either. Also, it assumes you already know who the vision holder for the game is. This is the person that encapsulates what the theme of your project is. He knows what he wants the player to feel at every moment, and that person's at the top tier of the entire hierarchy alone. And it doesn't have to be the lead designer. In fact, I think the idea of the lead designer always being at the top of a project is kind of a fallacy. A number of projects that I've seen work very well are ones where there's a lead artist or a lead programmer, lead producer at the top of the tier, and they're the ones that understand the game the best and can communicate the vision the best. So it doesn't always have to be the lead designer, although it can be. But ultimately, the important thing is that person's all the way at the top of the heap, and they're making all the calls if there's ever any doubt about what the game is or where the game should go. So assumption number two. Here's where I start getting angry. So in the past, I've been on projects where the producers will tell me that the best thing for the project is to have co-leads. There's like 2 lead artists. There's 2 lead designers. And I cannot fucking stand that. I feel that anytime you have 2 people on the same level, that just ends up being very confusing for everybody, and sometimes confusing for those 2 people that share the same role. The only time I've ever seen that work is when the 2 people don't care what the other person is doing. The best example I have is, once upon a time, there were 3 project directors in charge of a project, but because one of them cared about art, one of them cared about technical art, and one of them cared about game design, their paths never overlapped, so they didn't actually care what the other person was doing. So they sort of formed this hierarchy sort of instinctually by themselves, and that's great, but maybe they should have had different titles instead of all being project director of the same project. That's because I prefer that everybody on the team explicitly know that when 2 people in a room are talking about a subject, that they know who the person in the room is who can make the final call, yes or no, on any design decision. And I feel that's very, very important for getting things done. So assumption number 3. When you have a hierarchy, that doesn't mean you surrender your responsibility to the project in either direction. And what I mean by that is, if no matter what your rank, whether you're a junior designer, an intern designer, you have a responsibility to raise an issue that's going to hurt the game and bring that up with your superior. That is your responsibility. Also, you have a responsibility to understand, uphold, and carry out the vision and direction that the project director has laid out for the project. And if you ever have any doubts about this, you absolutely won't have any doubts when you're in the same position as your project director, because you'll want the people below you to also uphold your vision and support you just like you did supporting your project director. And if you are at the top of the hierarchy, you have a responsibility to listen to people when they bring issues to your attention. You usually don't have to listen more than once as long as you give a critique and a reason as to why it's not an issue or how it's going to be fixed. But you do have a responsibility to make sure that when you do address that issue, you do so in a positive format. Because if you get very, very angry, or if you give a lot of negative feedback or beat somebody down for bringing up an issue, you are basically training everyone beneath you to stay silent when they see something bad, because you've taught them they're going to get punished for it. Don't be that kind of leader. Also, if you're at the top of the heap, or you're a sub-lead, the higher the level you are in the hierarchy, you also have a responsibility to communicate the vision for the project and the goal. When people are doing work on your project, they shouldn't have any questions about standards, where the project is going, what type of feel the game should have. That is your responsibility to communicate it to everyone. And that all has to do with expectations, which I'll get to a little bit later. So, assumption number 4. And by the way, Fantastic Four is in fact one of the shittiest movies I have ever seen. I didn't believe it, and then I watched it. And just from the costume design alone, I could have had a conversation for hours with character modelers about what makes a superhero movie fail just from Fantastic Four. That may be my next presentation after this. Anyway, so assumption number 4 is I have a bias about how things should be structured over about 20 years. And I'm kind of old and grumpy about this, and you're welcome to challenge it. But my internal hierarchy for design is pretty simple. There are some projects where they have it set up, so there's one guy, there's a bunch of followers that are coming along behind him, nodding their heads like a bobblehead, or the fattest guy on the project is the most aggressive and strongest guy of them all, so therefore he makes all the calls. But what I prefer to see when coming on a project is a hierarchy structure like this. And preferably, I like to see it for the entire team, organized by department. But ultimately, I usually just care about seeing firsthand what the design structure is like. And most of my experience comes from role-playing games, so your mileage may vary when it comes to these suggestions. But this is what I've gathered over the 20 years of doing role-playing games for a system that I think works really well. So at the top of any design structure, you have the lead designer, who may or may not be drunk with power. Then beneath him, you have the systems lead, and they're in charge of all the moment-to-moment gameplay on the project. And then beneath the systems designer, then is the level designer, and they answer to the systems guy. And what they do is they take all the moment-to-moment systems, and they set the backdrop and the stage for those systems to play out. And then all the way at the bottom, you have the story lead, if you're lucky enough to even have a writer on the project. And their goal is to take all the systems and level design stuff, and with their beautiful writing, see about making up a context for all these systems and levels to play out that actually complements the player experience. So why do I advocate this structure? And that's a pretty simple reason. First off, the systems lead I put at the top of the food chain for a very simple reason. They're in charge of the gameplay from second to second, and to be honest, if the player is not having fun from second to second, that's a big problem for the game right there. And system designers handle things like, hey, they have to make sure the weapon design is solid, and the character's movement set is all nailed down, and all the weapons feel right, from reloading to how they feel to how they fire. All those things are part of the system designer's experience. But to put it more simply, if Mario does not, if the act of jumping with Mario does not feel satisfying from a moment-to-moment basis, that's going to screw the rest of the design. In fact, the level designers are going to be in hell if you haven't nailed down the specs with which Mario can jump, whether it's height, how far he can jump, how far his arc is when he jumps. That's all the province of a level designer in order for them to be actually able to build the stage for these systems to play out. And I usually find that with level design, that ends up being the biggest number of designers that usually end up being on a project. And again, they set up the stage for the systems. And like I was saying with the Mario example, if the systems, from weapon design to how fast the character can run and jump, if that stuff is in flux while the level designers are trying to make levels, there's no way that they're actually going to complete their work in a satisfactory manner because it's so dependent on their systems. The more the systems are in flux, the more the levels will stay in flux, and those will actually waste a lot of time and resources from the production of the game. And again, back to the Mario example, and if you can't get this right from the system perspective, you're just going to have a very, very sad Mario and a whole lot of sad level designers that may want to burn you in effigy. So anyway, getting your systems down first before you start building the stage they play out on is very, very important. All right, then at the bottom we have the story lead. And the story guy is the one who sets up the context and reinforces why these systems exist, why you go to these levels, and sort of help give the player a motivation to keep going through the game. And the reason I put the story part at the bottom is not to put myself out of a job. It's actually because I found when it comes to story, that's the most flexible part of game design that takes the least amount of resources to change and help support and fix other elements of the game. And thus, the fact they can answer the systems of the level guy is what puts them at the bottom of the hierarchy. So one of the many angry arguments that I have with myself is there's been points in the past where people have discussed that when it comes to project structure, why can't people share roles? Like, why can't the lead designer also be the lead level guy? Or why can't the project director also be the systems guy? And I mean, those kind of super developers out there exist. Like, why not have them share roles like that? Well, I already talked about co-leads, so I'm not going to go back to that angry place. But what I haven't spoken about is the role sharing aspect, where one person holds two different titles. And my personal opinion is that is not the smart way to go. And there's a few reasons for that. It is possible for someone to share roles, and I've been on projects where that happens. The lead designer can also be the systems lead, or the lead designer can also be the narrative lead, which I unfortunately have done and absolutely regret it. Or worse, they end up holding three different titles, where the project director is also the lead designer, is also the lead level designer. And the reason for this is anytime I've seen a project where someone is wearing more than two hats, it becomes a pretty huge issue for getting things done. And the reason I say issue and not the word challenge is because challenge implies this should be solved. Like, this is an obstacle for us to fight past. No way. I think my feeling is the reason that it's an issue is because when you have the title sharing like that, sometimes projects get a little big. They get a little confusing. And the higher you are in the hierarchy, actually the less content you should be creating for the project. Your goal is when you have a certain height on the hierarchy, like say way up there at the top, what you want to do is the more content you create is actually doing the entire team a disservice. And it's actually doing yourself a disservice. And the reason for that is when you have a hierarchy like this, the higher on the pyramid you are, the more responsibility you need to take for steering the ship versus building the ship, because you are in a prime spot to see where the project could go wrong or how the project could be made better. And you also have the authority to fix that problem and carry out that solution without any debate and without any question. So if you end up putting on blinders where you're like, wow, today I'd really like to optimize a spell system, or I've got this great idea for how I could spec out the interface and implement it, that's pretty much going to distract you from any larger issues that are occurring with the game. Or you're delaying the work of other people, or else you're just simply wasting everyone else's time. I'm not saying you don't have the ability to do it. I'm just questioning whether you should do it at all, and my feeling is you shouldn't. So the higher up you are, use your authority to make a good game, and use that authority for the good of the game. So a little note about expectations, which I mentioned earlier. So each of these roles, lead designer, system designer, level lead, story lead, even basic designers, junior designers, intern designers, all of those roles should have explicit expectations associated with them. While some expectations can be implied, it never hurts to lay them out. And the project director, or whoever's running the project, should absolutely be the one to lay out what these expectations are. And it sure beats negative reinforcement, because nothing's worse is when your project director has an expectation of what you should be doing on the project, but they failed to communicate it to you in any way, shape, or form. And I pretty much call that lazy leadership and basically lazy producing, and I don't have much patience for it. My opinion is if there's something that matters to you about what you want one of your employees to do, it's your responsibility to spec it out for them, especially if you're going to get mad at them about that. And if you do get mad about them, you are the one that should be punched in the face, like super fucking hard, because there's really no call for it in the first place. So with expectations, you should set them, and the expectations you lay out should actually be the bare minimum expectations that you want for the position. You want your sub-leads to establish metrics for how long it takes to construct and balance a spell, how long it takes to build a level. You want to get their help in laying out what the tasks are for each of their roles and their employees, how much time it takes to implement certain content. You want to make sure they prioritized all their tasks so that they know that, hey, when someone gets a list of 5 tasks in their queue, they know to tackle the A priority task versus the C priority task, and that way the decision is already made for them. And I don't care what your management structure is for that, like you'd be 2 dueling monkeys for all I care, but ultimately it is your responsibility as a sub-lead or a lead designer to set up a system that helps answer those decisions for people when they are confronted with questions like that. Sub-leads should also determine like how each design component should be laid out, how they fit together. Also be aware of and make sure they have all the assets that their employees need to get the workflow done. They need to set up the proper formatting for how they want the design documents laid out, the visual flow, the maps, how the maps fit together, the keys, the sort of the high points of what happens at the level where certain skills are being tested, and ultimately laying out each of the things that needs to be done for each aspect of the design, as well as setting up standards for each element of the design. And that can be things like, hey, well, here's how fast we want your levels to run, here's the scope of your levels. And no matter what the sub-lead is, all the way down to the story lead, every single sub-lead is responsible for setting up a certain level of standards that they want all their employees to adhere to, even if it comes down to the sentence structure of how NPCs should communicate in the environment. They should also mentor their employees, big surprise there. They should also regularly give feedback once or twice a week at least. They should keep their team informed. They should keep the other departments informed. Ultimately, it's not enough just to have these roles. You have to set up expectations, like I mentioned before, to actually be associated with those roles as well. And you shouldn't develop these expectations in a vacuum at all. What you want to do is you want to do it in tandem with the other leads. Like you want to talk to the lead animator, the lead artist, ask them what they need from your design department, whether it's level, narrative, or systems, that actually helps them get their jobs done. And one argument that I've had in the past is sometimes there's supposedly a danger in setting these expectations, because once you set a minimum expectations, that's all that anybody's going to do. All they're going to do is check off the boxes and then go home at the end of the day. And my reaction to that is pretty dismal. When I get an answer like that, I get very, very, very coldly angry. And the reason for that is we shouldn't have hired anyone in the first place that just wants to do the job. There are a lot of passionate game developers out there that would kill for the chance to design games and are always eager to do more on a game. Those are the people that should have been hired in the first place. And the fact that you would even have that assumption that people would only do the bare minimum means that I'd probably question your own motivation as to what you think drives game development, because that's certainly not my opinion at all. So a little note on titles from like the level sub-lead and the system sub-lead. Why have titles at all? Another argument related to this is that I've heard assigning hierarchies and putting people in sub-lead roles, like system lead, et cetera. That isn't important, really. What's really important is that there's somebody on the team that are taking care of all the tasks that you would normally associate with those titles. And my response to that is, it's kind of bad form to answer an argument like that by going to your CEO and saying, well, it sounds to me like your title isn't important. What we really need to do is take all the tasks that you do and split them up across numerous people. And that doesn't always go so well. So my opinion is that I disagree with the need of lack for titles. When you give somebody a title, I feel that it answers a lot of questions about certain design aspects that crop up, and it gives answers to solutions before they even become questions. After all, when you've established these roles, hey, so-and-so's in charge of systems, so-and-so's in charge of levels, so-and-so's in charge of story, when suddenly your game has a problem where there's a lot of unoptimized levels that are causing the game to lag and slow down, instantly when you look at your hierarchy role, you know the first designer who should be hopping onto it. It's not even a question. The level lead's the one who's supposed to be in charge of that because he is the level lead. Or even better, chances are the level lead can see that problem happening earlier than anybody else and can start forming a plan on their own. Basically, setting up these titles, I feel, empowers people to take action before anyone else because they recognize that it's their responsibility, and that's what comes with the titles. And even better, it also causes other people on the team that see issues like that, they know exactly who to go to bring up that issue. So if they see an optimization problem before anybody else, they know exactly who the level lead is, and they can go directly talk to that person and get it resolved. And I call that produced. Woo, all taken care of. Actually, it's pre-produced, which actually is the very definition of produced. Supposing you have an example where you have an issue with the spell system. Okay, well, if you need a spell system for level advancement in RPG, chances are you're probably going to want to talk to your system guy, and that's his responsibility. They'll set up the pacing of the spells, like at what level you get what, like how the power escalates. And sure, they may coordinate with a level designer, for example, about where those spells should be placed in the environment, so the player actually gains a hold of those and how they encounter them over the game flow procedure. But again, because those roles are laid out the way they are, it just reduces a lot of questions about how that design aspects actually get implemented. So when you have umbrella roles like that, that can solve a lot of issues for you right at the forefront. So one more note on titles. Who actually gets a title on your project? Like, who gets to be level lead? Who gets to be creative lead? Who gets to be systems lead? And for me, the answer is pretty simple. Whoops. Whoa, I did not keep clicking. See? It's easy. Yay. So in my opinion, it's pretty easy. The way you decide, it's quite simply the person who's doing the job. Or it's the person you feel is best suited to the job, or it's a person that you've hired to do that job. It's not rocket science. So another argument I've heard is sometimes on a team, there will be someone who's supposedly best suited for a role, but no one will give them the title to do it. And their argument is, well, I wouldn't trust that person with that responsibility, even though you have. Then my only answer to that is, then either you need to find someone to fill that role that you do trust, or you might want to recognize that you yourself started somewhere in the industry And if someone had not given you more responsibility at a certain point, you wouldn't have gotten to the position that you were at. And quite frankly, if somebody is doing the job, then you should give them the title. Like it's almost not even a matter for debate. And quite frankly, I've found that when you give people responsibility for certain aspects of the game, they can really step up and surprise you in ways you couldn't have imagined. But ultimately, if you've hired correctly at your company, you want people that can do a good job and always take the initiative anyway. And if they are doing the tasks and the role, and you choose not to give them the title, then that causes a lot of sad faces all around. And ultimately, maybe it's you who should be fired rather than them demoted or not given the position that they deserve. Because ultimately, you should give credit where credit is due. And if that person is doing the job, give them the title. It's just that simple. And furthermore, otherwise, you're probably going to end up making a big old mess on your project. So anyway, those are some basic assumptions and self-arguments. In conclusion, if you walk onto a project or you're making a project and you don't see a clear hierarchy, ask for one, make one, and help enforce one when it actually exists. It can solve a lot of problems and answer a lot of questions before things go off the rails, helps things run more smoothly, and ultimately helps things get produced. And it lets everyone make fun games easier and faster. So thank you very much for listening to me, and I would be happy to take questions. And I believe we have a microphone that is roaming around here.
Okay, we have 2 questions already, so.
Oh my God, 2 questions already. Is it mom and dad? I told them I was in Hawaii.
2 guys, I don't know how it works by you.
Okay, so my first question, did you draw all of the Stickman pictures?
I did indeed.
Okay.
I have sketchbooks upon sketchbooks of stick figures. That was an easy question. You're kidding me. Is that it?
Okay,
Produced.
this one might be a bit more difficult. Okay, because I want to ask you about sharing roles, okay? Because I've never worked on a huge project, so...
How huge?
I've never worked on a huge project. My biggest project was like, 30 people, and I was the lead of... There were like 8 people under me maximum, so those weren't like hundreds of people. But in my opinion, in my experience, games are often about, finding the weights between things, between like code and art and design. And if you are at the top of a tree, not even if you are off the top of the tree, all the time you have to weight those things. Sometimes certain solutions brilliant from a design point of view are kind of crappy from a code point of view, and sometimes it is better, it is cheaper, and to find a new solution that will, to seek for a new solution. And those things can be, I don't know how to make them differently, how to weight them if you don't understand the importance of that. And this can be done only by the person that can touch both, that can understand both fields. Okay, that's the question.
So I think that's a problem on any size game you're doing, absolutely. Ultimately, in that situation, what you're really dealing with there is how much time do we have, which usually equates to money or some other pressure. The important thing to do is to communicate to the people involved in that decision why you're making that decision based on time and money so they understand the reason for it. They may not be happy about your decision. It may not ultimately be the best possible solution for the game, say, as opposed to rewriting the rendering engine over the course of 5 more years and releasing the game then. But there's practical solutions and then there's impractical solutions. And I think the important thing to do there is as long as the people involved in the decisions know the reasons why you're making them, then they're more informed when they bring up similar issues in the future. They recognize there's the budgetary concerns. Oh, you already have a follow-up question. That's gonna be good. Go. Now you're going to tell me like you've found an entire crate of gold coins and money isn't an issue and time isn't an issue.
But this is not exactly what I was asking about. Because, okay, in that situation, you're saying the leading guy is making the decision, the top tier guy is making the decision. Okay, so the top guy has to make all those decisions while the lower guys have to like accept it because they don't have the responsibility. Sometimes you want them to take the responsibility, bring you a solution, then you say, okay, that worked, cool, and this is what you want.
No, so part of the role for production or a project director is when they spec out certain tasks, before those issues even get raised, there are certain milestones and deadlines that the entire team has to hit. What usually I find happens is all the people involved in the decision on the frontline trenches recognize what that deadline is, and usually they are able to discuss it amongst themselves in terms of what makes a practical solution. That happens a lot more often than you might think. The problem becomes when they hit a stalemate and one is convinced that their way of approach is better than another and the other person refuses to see it, and at that point it starts going up the chain. I like to think that all developers are responsible when it comes to making deadlines. Not all of them are, obviously. But at the same time, I feel that the knowledge that people that are on the front lines, they should be able to bring that knowledge with them to the project director, the lead programmer, lead artist, and explain to them what the problem is that they're facing when it comes to time or budget and why a certain thing won't be done in the time it is. At that point, the lead needs to figure out and weigh the pros and cons of choosing either solution based on what they know about the project, and that's what I'm saying.
I have one comment to that question. Could you elaborate, from your point of view, what scale of team is a moment where this what you said about is necessity? When you need to have this structure, or does it like from two, when it's two guys, it's obvious you have to have some roles assigned?
I'd probably say about 15 people.
15, yeah?
15.
Okay, and do you see a possibility that one person is like in both shoes, like has two roles at the same time, switching in small team, like has two responsibilities at the time? Is it possible?
Generally, we found that so the small team size, I'm specifically referring to the Fallout New Vegas DLCs. What we did was we broke down all those individual roles amongst specific people. Granted, we only had one lead programmer, so actually programmers didn't break down into different disciplines. There was only just the one lead programmer, and part of his role was there's only a limited number of stuff that you're going to be able to do for the DLCs because of the nature of what they are, and thus his role became constrained somewhat. But when it came to design of the DLC, we did have a lead systems guy, we did have a lead level guy, we did a lead narrative guy. There weren't a lot of other floating designers beyond that, but those guys knew what their responsibilities were.
Awesome. Okay, we have a question here.
Hi, Chris. Thank you for your talk. I want to ask, you pointed out that writers and narrative guys are pretty low in this chain of designers, but what if they were brought in production pretty early in the development, and while game designers are essentially creating the systems and the core concepts of the gameplay, what narrative people can do at the same time? Are they creating lore? Are they writing some, I don't know, atmospheric pieces, some stories that can inspire the team? What's your view on these actions? Thank you.
Well, so ideally in a perfect world, like it's great for the writers to come on at square one, and I would argue that just bring one writer on at square one and let that person work with the leads until you're ready to open it up for full production and bring in more writers, because there's so much stuff that's in flux during pre-production that having a lot of people in any one department actually can cause a lot of chaos versus helping like get things moving forward and getting things decided. Now, every project that I've been involved with where I come in square one as a designer, there's always some system element or some pillar of the game that they're trying to do with the title. Like in every instance, they've established at least 3 pillars for what the game will be like, and that's generally enough for any writer to start working and figuring out what a story around that would be. They shouldn't finalize it until the end of pre-production when all the systems have been proven and laid out, but ultimately there's usually always something there that you can sort of grab onto. Like, so for example, with Fallout New Vegas, like, there were a number of game pillars that were already present from square one as soon as we started that title. We're like, okay, well, we need a big city for the game to revolve around. That's like one of the pillars of the title. And we're like, okay, well, it's gonna be Vegas. So once you have that big pillar, that's a lot of material for a writer to start working on in terms of like digging into the history of Vegas, like what makes that city tick, what's appealing about it, why you'd wanna have a power fantasy there, all sorts of other aspects. And it doesn't require a lot of pillars for a writer just to get rolling on it.
Awesome, next question.
This is sort of a related question because you said in the presentation that writing like story was the cheapest to do, so that's why narrative designers should be like down below the hierarchy. But is this also true like when you're in full production and something changes in the systems and you should make a change in the narrative, but then you have all those cutscenes and dialogue that may be recorded already? So how is that? Is it only cheapest in the earlier stages of the project, or is it still true in the later stages, even with those big assets
So that's a
involved?
good question. So it does get more expensive towards the end of the project, especially once the voice acting occurs and once localization occurs. At that point, however, I found there's actually been very few opportunities to change that material once it's actually done. So that cost actually kind of stays static. And even so, the cost of that stuff still is much, much less than the actual construction of the levels and the construction of the full game and all the programming that went into it. It may seem expensive by itself, but when you compare it to the rest of the game, it's actually a drop in the bucket, and still more flexible than a lot of other elements in the game. Another reason I say it's sort of at the bottom is because sometimes level design and system design will encounter various challenges in the game that they can't get around. So for example, they might want to have a wilderness level in a third-person shooter where for whatever reason in this wilderness environment, the enemies have a really hard time properly finding cover. And supposing like it's a sci-fi scenario and programmers have spent like 2 weeks trying to get the cover points all set up for trees and fallen logs, a writer can come in and writers can go, well, if the enemies you face in this level are cyborgs, which is 1 sentence of lore, and they were designed for combat, 2nd sentence of lore, they have been programmed never to take cover, and they always attack the player and never retreat against any odds. 3rd line of lore, months of programming is set free. The level designers don't fight with the programmers anymore, and you got it solved, and you got a beautiful wilderness level with cyborgs. You're all set. Story's cheap. Story's great. We can think up all sorts of solutions for your problems. Just let us know what those problems are.
Okay, we have some more questions.
The most memorable parts of Fallout 2 was New Reno and Vault City, I suppose, and I heard that you designed them. And is it true that you didn't know what the other part of designers are doing? What are the other cities and places in Fallout 2? I heard that rumor.
So some clarification. So the question about Fallout 2 and 2 areas that I worked on. One was a very large area called New Reno, which is way too big. And the other one was an area called Vault City, where I believe I was the 3rd designer that came onto it. I think Leonard Bayarski was the first draft. Then we had a 2nd designer, and then I came in to finish it up. And I did a lot more quests for the area, and I enjoyed working on it, but there was a lot of groundwork that was already set up. So on that project, there were two big problems. One was there absolutely was not enough time. Like, people would swing by the office and go, hey, how's Fallout 2 going? I noticed you're here like at 9 p.m. on a Saturday. Like, is it going good? Because if this doesn't go good, I'm gonna lose my job. So there was that time pressure and the work pressure that we didn't have as much time to play and research the game as much as we wanted to, and it came out with a lot of bugs, which is really unfortunate. The other problem was it didn't actually have a hierarchy. Like, I know from the design department, in my opinion, it was just a huge mess for that game. Like, there was no creative oversight, there was no creative lead. I couldn't tell you who the level lead was or the systems lead. I think we had one full-time programmer. Not the best way to organize a project. But the biggest regret that I have for Fallout 2 was there was no creative lead, because that meant all the areas aesthetically felt different, and there were like a lot of jokes and not a lot of consistency between the areas, and I absolutely think it made that game weaker.
You briefly touched on the topic of having good hires. What qualities do you look for when you need to hire a system designer?
Oh, for a systems designer. Okay, so the first thing that we do is we've actually had a lot of trouble finding system designers in general. And I don't know whether that's just a rare quality or if people just aren't naturally inclined to that, but they are very rare. What we try and do for all designer hires is we actually make sure that aside from the round of interviews and then doing the asshole test to see if they work well in a communal environment, what we try and look for is we actually set up a test very specifically for the game that we're trying to do. So, for example, if we were doing a level design test for South Park, there's a much different criteria for how to build the levels in South Park versus, hey, we need you to build a region in Fallout New Vegas. For systems, we try and do the same thing. What we do is usually there's a balance part of the test where we ask them to take a certain part of a game that's on the market that we know has some problems. And we're like, you know what? We need you to critique this, list all the problems that you see with game balance with regards to this. And ideally, it's a game in the same genre that you're hiring for. And then once you ask them with that task, then the next stage of the task is, well, now I need you to propose how you would fix those problems within the span of a month and get it all tested and balanced and how you would organize that procedure. And then, depending on what we actually need from the systems guy, usually a lot of our projects were very class-based, like, hey, make a fighter, hey, make a mage. What we would ask some people to do is, we want you to make a brand new class for this game, lay out all the advancement schemes that you would do for this, how it would work with the other party members, the other classes, why it would be a viable class, and then tell us how it would play out on one of the levels that already exists in the game. And that would be some of the tests that we would offer for a systems designer, but it would always be related to the game that we were hiring for, as opposed to some sort of nebulous design test.
Okay.
Hi, thanks for the talk.
Hey, thanks for coming.
My pleasure. I had two questions. One is more serious and pertaining to the role of the writer. The second is more cheeky. So, okay, with the first one. In Torment, Planescape Torment, and in New Vegas, despite the fact that you said that the lead writer is supposed to be kind of on the bottom and be the one who fixes issues, I kind of felt that the design of the game felt a bit subordinate to the writing, as in the systems interacted well enough with each other that I felt that, for example, dying in Torment came as a result of the writer saying that it's supposed to be that way.
You are very kind.
So I wanted to ask, was that a result of a fine working hierarchy, or was it just a fluke, or just a lucky mistake, or I don't know?
Well, so I do have a caveat to writers being at the bottom. And writers are solely at the bottom when all they're doing is writing. And I don't think any writer should be doing that. What a writer should be doing is turn the dialogue into a system that the player's actually engaging with and playing, whether it's like morality tests or you get more alignment points, or depending on how you solve the dialogue, that becomes more of a system. And like I would argue the Telltale games are a lot like that. That's one aspect. I don't always feel that approaching a game from the story angle and then enforcing the story on systems is really the best way to go. I think sometimes just focusing on the theme of what you want the player to feel during the game and constructing a story around that in tandem with the systems is the best way to go. Now, Torment was a bit different because there were elements in the dialogue system that were intended to be systematic, but there were other system parts of that game that I felt were incredibly weak and I think made the game suffer for it. And I'll be honest, like the coming back from the dead, that was more like well, I'm just sick of dying in role-playing games. Like, it just makes me reload the game, and I lose all my progress, and it fucking sucks. Like, why do we even die? Why even set somebody back? Why don't we make death an advancement mechanic where it teleports you to new areas, or you get access to areas you wouldn't because everyone thinks you're dead? Like, that seemed like a much more fun way to go about it. But sometimes the story will influence systems like that, but I prefer going from systems to story and sort of reflecting more on what you want the player to feel on a moment-to-moment basis.
And for the less serious question, will we see an aspect of Ravel in Original Sin 2, or are you done with those mods?
No, I can't do that. So Ravel's a character in Torment that she branches out across the planes, and she has a bunch of different personalities in various of the D&D games, like Icewind Dale and Icewind Dale 2, like she shows up there. But because she's so D&D focused, she can't go outside that franchise, otherwise Ravel will get sued. And she doesn't have that many gold coins on her, and she doesn't have really good legal representation. So she's all powerful, but not that powerful. So.
Okay, we are running out of time. I have a last question to ask about how to learn to let go of things. You said some stuff during your presentation about going higher in the hierarchy and learning to trust people or not to trust, but give them responsibility. I think that this is very hard for people in small teams, that they grow and at some point they lose control a bit. Do you have any mental exercise, favorite sentence to repeat to yourself?
Yes, I do. It's leave it for the DLC or leave it for the sequel. Okay. No idea is ever really lost. You just don't have to get them all into one game because the game might suffer for it. Just keep it in mind for expanded content or when you do the sequel to the game, and then introduce that idea, make it as polished as can be. But sometimes throwing too many ideas into a game, it's not hard to show people examples of how that doesn't work. And as long as they still feel like they'll have a chance to make that idea a reality, generally that conversation goes pretty well.
Awesome, thank you for that. I think that Chris deserved our loud applause. Thank you.